Hey guys, tonight we step into the land between two rivers where moonlight sits on moving water like a ribbon and the air smells faintly of wet clay and reeds. You are here for the Anunnaki Descendants. Are they already among us? But we're going to keep it calm, careful and sleep friendly. Most historians agree that Mesopotamia gives us some of the earliest cities, and writing and archaeology suggests those achievements grow from very human needs like food, water and organisation. It's possible that later myths echo real social changes, but historians debate the details and will treat mystery as mystery. Some parts are widely accepted history, some parts are interpretation, and some parts are calm. What if imagination? You probably won't survive this in the classic staying awake through ancient accounting sense, but we'll try anyway. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And tell me your location and your local time in the comments so I can picture this story drifting across different nights. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You place your feet, at least in your imagination, on the flat floodplains between the Tigris and Euphrates. This is Mesopotamia. The land between rivers and water is both gift and threat. When the rivers cooperate, they leave rich silt that makes fields productive. When they don't, they flood, they shift channels and they erase boundaries, reminding you that land can be a temporary idea. Most historians agree that early urban life in southern Mesopotamia, often linked to Sumer, develops over long stretches of time, from farming communities into dense city-states. Archaeology suggests irrigation canals, organised fields and storage systems help produce enough surplus to support specialists, builders, potters, traders, priests, and the quiet power player of the ancient world, the scribe. The first mainstream anchor you hold onto is simple. One of the earliest known writing systems appears here and changes what humans can do with memory. The evidence we do have points to cuneiform starting as practical record keeping, the ancient equivalent of who got what, when and why. Barley sheep, jars of oil rations for workers, lists that keep the social machine from squealing. If you hoped the first written line in history is a poetic prophecy, you get something closer to Count the Goats, which is honestly relatable. Joke, one civilization invents writing and immediately uses it to create the world's first spreadsheet, only with more goats and fewer colours. As your mind drifts toward a temple precinct, you notice how religion and administration overlap without apology. Archaeology suggests temples are not only spiritual centres, but also major institutions that organise labour and distribute goods in many places and periods. You picture storerooms stacked with grain workshops, humming with weaving, and officials tracking offerings and rations with the same tired competence you see in any modern workplace. One interpretation is that when a text says a God provides, it can reflect how an institution provides with the divine name acting like an official stamp. A more cautious explanation could be that people genuinely experience the world through sacred language, so the boundary between system and spirit is not a hard line in their minds. Now the name that floats through the river mist Anunnaki. What's broadly accepted is that the Anunnaki appear in Mesopotamian myth and ritual language as a group of deities, though their roles and associations can vary across time, place and text. Some traditions connect them with divine authority and assembly, and other passages lean in different directions depending on the story being told. Historians still argue whether the term consistently refers to the same set of gods, or whether it shifts meaning depending on context and genre. That is your first reminder to keep the solid ground separate from the mist. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm, because the surviving evidence is partial. The genres differ, and even a single word can travel across centuries, wearing different coats. A careful reading might suggest that divine genealogies and councils sometimes mirror human politics. If power on earth is complicated, power in the sky can be complicated too, and myth becomes a way to make hierarchy feel orderly. You can almost hear a storyteller speaking names that sound like titles, while the stylus keeps scratching, turning breath into clay. Joke to some. Well, a temple administrator is basically running cosmic customer support, and you are on hold behind a guy calling about missing barley. A more cautious explanation could be that people use divine assemblies as a language for justice and order, not as a literal meeting you can attend with a clipboard and a visitor badge. So you approach the big question like you are carrying a cup of tea over a sleeping cat. The Anunnaki Descendants, are they already among us? Let me rephrase that more carefully, because we're not proving anything tonight. We're following clues. That's a possibility, not a certainty. And it depends on what descendants means. It's possible some listeners imagine literal lineage, a biological thread passed down like an heirloom. It's also possible that a more historically grounded meaning is cultural inheritance stories, symbols, habits of thought, the way people explain power and origin. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. And we're going to keep those lanes separate so your mind can relax instead of tightening into certainty. This is where the modern fog rolls in, and we label it honestly. A fringe idea proposes that the Anunnaki were not symbolic deities at all, but outsiders, visitors. Something like the sci-fi picture of beings arriving from the sky and leaving traces behind. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it persists because it offers a simple explanation for a complicated past, and it makes the everyday feel charged with secret significance. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, we can ask what evidence would be needed to support it, and whether our actual sources provide that kind of support. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so, and we'll resist the temptation to turn thin evidence into thick certainty just because it's bedtime and your brain likes dramatic plots. Back on solid ground, you notice details that do not need any cosmic twist to be fascinating. Workers haul reeds and bricks. Merchants bargain over wool and grain. Families share bowls of porridge while someone tells a story that makes the children go quiet, not from fear, but from awe. Most historians agree that early city life involves specialization and coordination, and that coordination creates records, seals, and rules. Cylinder seals can roll tiny scenes into wet clay like a signature stamp, and even that feels like a quiet form of identity. This mark belongs to this person, this household, this office, this promise. Joke 3. If you ever feel powerless, remember that one of humanity's oldest flexes is, I stamped it, therefore it's official. You slow your breathing and you let the fan hum blend with the imagined river. One interpretation is that the Anunnaki endure in the modern imagination because the name sits at the crossroads of big questions. Where did order come from? Who gets power? And why does the sky feel important when you are knee-deep in mud? What if the story is pointing at something else? What if descent is about legitimacy, not anatomy? The evidence we do have points to societies using sacred language to explain hierarchy, duty and justice, and it's possible that later readers hungry for bigger drama reshape that language into something more literal than the originals require. So you end this first stretch of the walk with two hands open. In one hand, the mainstream history, rivers, canals, bricks, and the quiet invention of writing on clay. In the other, the misinterpretation, rumour, and gentle imagination kept clearly labelled as possibility. You take one more slow step along the riverbank, ready to follow the name Anunnaki deeper into the night without letting it pull you off the path. You keep walking as if the ground is made of packed silt and patience, and the air stays cool enough to feel clean in your nostrils. The river sound becomes a steady, sleepy metronome, and you let it pace your thoughts the way a slow playlist paces a late-night drive. Archaeology suggests that when writing first takes hold, here it does not arrive as literature. It arrives as a tool. The evidence we do have points to small clay tablets used for accounting, administration, and obligations. And most historians agree that this practical origin makes the later explosion of stories even more impressive. A careful reading might suggest that the first great miracle of writing is not prophecy, but memory that can be audited. You enter a space that feels like an ancient office, except quieter and dustier, and with fewer fluorescent lights trying to ruin your mood. You can almost smell the clay damp at first, then drying into something chalky and permanent. Scribes sit with reeds cut into wedges, pressing and lifting, like they are teaching the earth to speak in tiny footprints. What's broadly accepted is that cuneiform develops over time, shifting from pictorial marks to more abstract signs, and it's possible that this shift reflects a society getting faster at being complicated. Your mind does a small sleepy nod because you recognize the pattern. Life starts simple, then someone invents a form to fill out, and suddenly you need a specialist just to explain the form. A mainstream anchor settles in, writing supports bureaucracy, and bureaucracy supports large institutions. Archaeology suggests temples and palaces become centres where goods are gathered and redistributed, and the evidence we do have points to rations given to workers, lists of deliveries, and records of land and labour. One interpretation is that the presence of so many lists is not boring but revealing, because lists show what mattered enough to count. Grain mattered, wool mattered, beer mattered. Also, surprisingly often, the exact number of sheep mattered, in a way that feels personally targeted at anyone who has ever lost track of a household budget. Joke 1, you invent civilization, and the very next boss message is please itemize your barley. In this calm, administrative world, you notice something else that writing does. It turns spoken authority into a durable object. A more cautious explanation could be that people still rely heavily on oral tradition, but writing becomes a new layer of trust, a way to say, this is what we agreed, even if the speaker is no longer in the room. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm, because we cannot always see how the average person felt about these tablets. Did they find them reassuring, like a receipt, or intimidating, like a bill? Historians still argue whether early writing was primarily a neutral technology or a tool that amplified inequality by favouring trained elites. Your attention drifts toward the relationship between writing and myth. Most historians agree that many myths were spoken long before they were written down, and archaeology suggests that later scribes preserve older themes while also shaping them for new audiences. One interpretation is that the act of recording a story changes it, the way photographing a place changes how you remember it. To be clear, this is debated because we cannot rewind time and compare the exact spoken versions. Still, a careful reading might suggest that written myths often carry the fingerprints of the settings that preserved them: temples, schools, courts, and the expectations of those spaces. Now the Anunnaki re-enter the room not as a dramatic arrival, but as a name that appears inside a world already full of divine categories and roles. What's broadly accepted is that Mesopotamian religion includes many deities and groups, and texts can use different terms to organize divine hierarchies. The evidence we do have points to a complex mythic landscape where gods govern aspects of nature, city, identity, and cosmic order. A more cautious explanation could be that these categories shift over time and region, which makes any single modern summary risky. Let me rephrase that more carefully. If you want one clean chart of who is who and what they do, ancient Mesopotamia politely refuses. So why do modern minds latch so hard onto one name, Anunnaki, as if it is a single locked box with one secret inside? It's possible that the name feels like it carries weight and age, and that alone can make it magnetic. A fringe idea proposes that certain ancient terms are not just religious labels but references to literal beings, and that later scribes recorded encounters in symbolic language. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it thrives because writing can look like testimony if you forget that myth has its own logic. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, we can ask what kind of language would indicate literal reporting, and whether these texts behave like reports or like sacred narratives. Here is where you keep the solid ground separate from the mist. Documented writing exists, scribal schools exist, administrative records exist, myths exist and evolve. Interpreted myths may reflect social structure and power. Scribes may shape narratives for institutions. Imagined, what if a story hides a memory of outsiders, softened into sacred metaphor? Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. You drift into a scribal school, and the atmosphere changes from office to classroom. Young apprentices repeat signs the way modern students repeat multiplication tables, except their homework is draw this wedge correctly or the teacher will sigh at you for an hour. Archaeology suggests scribal training includes copying lists, proverbs, and model texts, and most historians agree this education forms a small influential class. One interpretation is that scribes become gatekeepers of cultural memory, not because they are villains twirling moustaches, but because literacy is time-consuming and specialization is expensive. Joke 2, imagine telling your family you are going to school for years just to become the person who writes down how many goats everyone owes, and then having to act like that is a glamorous career move. You can almost hear the stylus tap, 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 and it becomes a motif, a gentle percussion that keeps the night from getting too sharp. It's possible that this sound, repeated for generations, is part of why the ancient world feels both close and far. Close because you recognize the human rhythms of work and learning, far because the symbols look alien until you learn their rules. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm, because the inner lives of those scribes are mostly silent. We have their exercises, not their bedtime thoughts. As you move through the clay tablet world, you notice how easily modern imagination can slide into overconfidence. A popular rumour claims that tablets describe advanced technology in disguised terms, reading Chariots of the Gods into lines that may simply be poetic or ritual. That's a possibility, not a certainty. To be clear, this is debated, and the more cautious explanation could be that we are looking at metaphors shaped by an ancient worldview, not technical manuals. Still, the cinematic what-if mood is tempting. What if a strange visitor is remembered as a god because no other category fits? What if the stylus scratches down or not engineering? You hold that temptation gently like a fragile object, and you put it back on the shelf labelled possible not proven. Then you return to what the evidence we do have points to: a civilization building systems, storing surplus training specialists, and leaving written traces that allow you thousands of years later to walk through the night and feel the presence of people you will never meet. It's possible that the most incredible thing among us is not a hidden descendant, but the persistence of human pattern making, the way we keep turning mud into meaning. Your steps remain slow and steady, and the river stays beside you, patient as a long sentence. The stylus sound continues soft and repetitive, as if the night itself is practicing letters. You drift onward with that soft stylus rhythm still tapping in your mind, and you notice how quickly a city-state can feel familiar when you stop expecting it to be exotic. The air is still river cool, and the streets are narrow packed earth, rubbed smooth by feet and time. In the distance, a temple platform rises above low rooftops, and you feel the pull of it the way you feel the pull of a downtown skyline, like your body already knows where power tends to gather. Archaeology suggests that temples in many Mesopotamian cities function as major economic hubs, and most historians agree that these institutions organize labour, manage, storage, and sponsor crafts. One interpretation is that when ancient texts credit a god for prosperity, they may also be crediting the temple system that coordinates it, and you let a cinematic what if float in for a second. What if the divine voice in a tablet is sometimes the institution speaking through a sacred mask? You move closer and everything becomes a choreography of work. Porters carry baskets of grain. Weavers pass bundles of wool. Someone repairs a reed mat roof with the same tired focus you use when you finally decide to fix that one thing in your house that squeaks. The evidence we do have points to ration systems and organised labour, and what's broadly accepted is that early urban life depends on coordination, not just individual skill. A careful reading might suggest that the true engine of the city is not a hero king, but scheduled storage and the quiet pressure of accountability. Joke 1, you came for cosmic mysteries, and you end up in the world's first warehouse where the main supernatural force is inventory management. Inside the temple precinct, the atmosphere changes, the smells sharpen. Warm bread, sour beer, incense, wet clay, and animal hide all blend into something dense and human. You see altars and offerings, but you also see doors to storerooms, ledgers, and officials. Most historians agree that religion and governance are not separate categories here, the way they often are in modern life. A more cautious explanation could be that people experience the sacred as woven into everything. So asking where spirituality ends and administration begins is like asking where the river ends and the floodplain begins. Historians still argue whether temples primarily serve as spiritual centres that happen to manage resources, or as economic institutions that naturally express their authority through religion. Your mind relaxes into that tension instead of trying to resolve it. Tonight we keep the solid ground separate from the mist, but we can still enjoy how the two edges touch. The solid ground is the institutional reality temples and palaces coordinate people and goods. The mist is the interpretive possibility divine language can encode authority and myth can reflect social order. And the gentle imagination is your cinematic what if. The idea that an official stamp, a ritual phrase, and a god's name might sometimes be three costumes for the same voice. You spot the palace and you feel another shift. The palace is different from the temple in mood, even if the two are intertwined. It's less incense and more command. More guard at the door, less open courtyard. Archaeology suggests palaces become important administrative centres in certain periods, and what's broadly accepted is that kingship grows into a central institution. One interpretation is that kings present themselves as chosen by gods to legitimize rule, and you can almost hear the political logic clicking into place. If you cannot make everyone love you, you at least make everyone agree that arguing with you is arguing with the sky. Joke 2. The oldest influencer strategy is apparently my sponsor is the cosmos. This brings you to the vibe of divine paperwork, which sounds like a joke until you see it. The same scribal hands that record barley can also record hymns, rituals, omens, and royal proclamations. The evidence we do have points to a broad scribal culture producing many genres of text, and most historians agree that written tradition becomes a tool of continuity. A careful reading might suggest that when divine names appear in official contexts, they help stabilize authority and they can unify a community around shared ritual language. That's a possibility, not a certainty, because the texts we have do not always tell us how ordinary people felt, and their feelings are the part that would be fun to know at 2 a.m. Now, because you are human, your mind tries to map this ancient structure onto the modern question of descendants. It's possible that when people say Anunnaki descendants, they are reaching for an explanation for why power sometimes feels hereditary, why certain families and elites seem to reproduce influence across generations. A more cautious explanation could be that human societies often create elite lineages for practical reasons: alliances, inheritance, training, and reputation. In that reading, Descendants of the Gods is less about biology and more about branding, like a royal logo stamped onto a family tree. But the mist has its own pull, and you let it in gently without letting it take over. A fringe idea proposes that ancient elites were not just claiming divine origin as metaphor, but preserving a literal memory of non-human ancestors. This theory isn't widely accepted, and the evidence is thin, but it thrives in the gaps where certainty ends. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, the question becomes, what do the texts actually do? Do they read like eyewitness accounts or like sacred narratives that serve social functions? The more cautious explanation could be that myths convey meaning, not reportage, and that their power lies in symbolism, not literal detail. You walk past a courtyard where someone is pouring beer into a bowl, and you feel the small comfort of the ordinary. It's possible that the best antidote to over-the-top theory is remembering that ancient people also dealt with sore feet, spilled food, family arguments, and work deadlines. Joke 3. Even if a god walked into the room, someone would still ask, "Did you sign the ration list?" As you move through the city, you notice how the built environment itself teaches hierarchy. The temple rises, the palace encloses, houses cluster, gates control flow. The evidence we do have points to planned spaces and defences in many city-states, and archaeology suggests that social stratification becomes visible in architecture and burial practice. One interpretation is that cosmic hierarchy and social hierarchy reinforce each other like two mirrors facing each other, making the same pattern look infinite. To be clear, this is debated because societies change and texts vary, but the pattern is suggestive, not conclusive. You pause near a wall where fresh clay seals are drying, and you watch a worker roll a cylinder seal across a tablet, leaving a tiny scene of figures and symbols. It feels intimate, like a signature, and also official, like a lock. What's broadly accepted is that seals function as identifiers and protectors of transactions. A careful reading might suggest that identity in this world is performed through marks, titles, and affiliations. And here the cinematic what if returns softly. What if Among Us is not about someone hiding alien ancestry, but about how identity hides in plain sight inside symbols we barely notice. You feel the night settle deeper. The temple drums are distant now, more like a memory than a sound. You keep walking, and the city keeps doing what cities do, feeding itself, organising itself, narrating itself. The solid ground remains strong. Institutions shape life, writing preserves authority, and myth gives it meaning. The mist remains gentle. Maybe some myths carry older memories. Maybe some symbols invite multiple readings. We're not proving anything tonight. We're following clues, and you let the clues feel like pebbles in your pocket, warm from your hand as you move forward. You let the city noise soften until it becomes a distant texture, like a blanket you can hear. Your feet carry you toward a quieter corner, where language feels heavier than brick, and names feel like they have their own gravity. The river air still smells like reeds and damp earth, and somewhere nearby a kiln breathes warmth into the night. Most historians agree that ancient Mesopotamian religion is not a single fixed system, but a living set of traditions that shift across centuries and city-states. Archaeology suggests that texts, seals, and temple practices preserve pieces of that shifting world, and it's possible that the very name Anunnaki changes its shade depending on who is speaking, when they are speaking, and why. You pause in the presence of a word and you notice how a single word can become a magnet for modern imagination. What's broadly accepted is that Anunnaki is a term found in Mesopotamian texts, often referring to a group of deities, though the details vary by context. The evidence we do have points to a world where gods are organised into families, assemblies, and ranked groups, and a careful reading might suggest that labels like Anunnaki help people talk about divine authority in a structured way. That's a possibility, not a certainty, because ancient categories do not always map neatly onto modern expectations. You lean in closer, like you are listening to someone whisper a definition in a library. Some scholars connect the term to ideas of lineage and status, with interpretations often circling around concepts like princely offspring or descendants associated with a high divine sphere. One interpretation is that the word itself carries a hint of hierarchy and that it functions like a title as much as a name. A more cautious explanation could be that the term is used flexibly and that later readers, including modern ones, sometimes want it to behave more consistently than it actually does. This is where you give your mind a gentle rule. Keep the solid ground separate from the mist. Solid ground is the existence of the term in texts, and the broader context of Mesopotamian mythic groupings. Mist is the temptation to treat the term like a single secret code that unlocks one hidden storyline. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm, because we do not have every text, every local tradition, or every spoken story that once surrounded these words. You take a slow step and imagine a scribe choosing which divine label to write, like picking the right category in a filing system that is also a prayer. Most historians agree that scribes work within schools and traditions, and archaeology suggests that education shapes how texts are copied and preserved. One interpretation is that a term like Anunnaki might sometimes reflect a scribal convention, a way to group deities for a particular narrative purpose. Let me rephrase that more carefully. The word may not point to one fixed roster of beings, but to a flexible idea that helps a story or ritual make sense. Historians still argue whether the Anunnaki are consistently tied to a specific domain, like the underworld in all traditions, or whether that association becomes stronger in certain texts and periods, while other contexts emphasize a different role. You let that debate sit in your mind like a candle in a drafty room, steady but not absolute. There's no full consensus, and that is exactly why the topic stays interesting without needing any dramatic certainty. You move through a temple courtyard where statues and symbols feel both familiar and foreign. The evidence we do have points to city gods, tied to specific places with cult centres and ritual calendars anchoring religious life. A careful reading might suggest that groups of gods like the Anunnaki can represent a larger divine order that stands above local identity, a way to connect one city's story to a wider cosmic structure. The cinematic what-if mood slides in gently. What if the name becomes a doorway? Because it sounds like it belongs to something bigger than one town, bigger than one king, bigger than one life. Now you notice the modern leap that happens in many conversations. People hear a term that might carry a sense of descent or lineage, and the imagination instantly turns it into genetics. It's possible that this leap is less about evidence and more about modern habits, because modern identity talk often begins with bloodlines and DNA charts. A more cautious explanation could be that ancient descent language is often symbolic, political, or ritual. A king can call himself descended from the gods to claim legitimacy, and the claim can function socially whether or not anyone treats it as biology. Your sleepy brain tries to simplify it anyway because brains love shortcuts. Joke one? Your brain hears descendants and immediately starts building a family tree with dramatic background music, even when the ancient text is just doing normal myth logic. You smile and let the shortcut pass by without grabbing it. This is where the fringe layer enters, carefully labelled. A fringe idea proposes that Anunnaki is not just a mythic grouping, but a memory of literal outsiders, and that the language of descent preserves a real lineage. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it remains popular because it offers a thrilling answer to a complicated puzzle. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, we can ask what kind of evidence would separate symbolic lineage from biological lineage. The evidence we do have points mainly to mythic and ritual contexts, which makes the literal reading difficult to establish. That does not end curiosity, it simply keeps curiosity honest. You keep walking and the night stays gentle, not spooky. No alarms, no ominous soundtrack. Just the soft scrape of sandals and the faint clink of pottery somewhere behind a wall. Archaeology suggests that daily life in these cities includes tradecraft and household routines that are intensely human. One interpretation is that myth grows out of that human ground using divine language, to frame the forces that shape survival: floods, harvests, power, sickness, fertility, justice. The cinematic what if mood returns in a safe way. What if the stories are pointing at something else? Not a secret species among us, but a deep memory of how fragile life feels when the river decides to change its mind. You pause near a shrine where offerings sit quietly, and you notice how reverence can coexist with pragmatism. The evidence we do have points to offerings, hymns, and ritual performances, and what's broadly accepted is that these acts help communities manage uncertainty. A more cautious explanation could be that calling a group of gods by a specific name helps people feel that the cosmos has structure. In that reading, Anunnaki is less a clue to hidden ancestry and more a tool for making the universe feel organised enough to live in. Joke too honestly, if I lived in a world where floods could rewrite the map overnight, I might also want a well-organised pantheon just for emotional customer service. You let that thought drift by like a boat on dark water. You turn the term around in your mind the way you might turn a smooth stone in your palm. You notice that a name can become more powerful than the stories it appears in, especially when it moves into new languages and new media. One interpretation is that modern retellings sometimes isolate a word like Anunnaki from its original context, then reattach it to modern themes like aliens, secret bloodlines, and hidden rulers. To be clear, this is debated and it varies widely by storyteller. A more cautious explanation could be that humans have always reused old names for new meanings, because names carry authority even when the details change. You take a slow breath and you remind yourself of the truth ladder softly, without turning it into a lecture. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. Documented is the term's presence in ancient sources and the broader religious complexity. Interpretation is how the term might function as a category of divine authority and hierarchy. Imagination is the cinematic what if that asks whether a mythic label might preserve an older kind of memory. Joke 3, and if you ever feel overwhelmed, just remember that even the gods in these stories are often stuck in meetings dealing with cosmic politics, which means the universe is basically one long committee session. You relax into that ridiculous comfort because it makes the divine feel less terrifying and more familiar. You continue through the quiet streets and the name Anunnaki follows you like a faint echo, not a shout. The solid ground stays firm under your feet. The mist stays in the air where it belongs, and the night remains what it is meant to be, a calm walk through ancient language with open questions held gently, not clenched into certainty. You keep moving as the city thins into open space and the sky becomes the main architecture. The rooftops fall away. The temple silhouette shrinks behind you, and above your head the stars look unusually close, like pinholes in a dark cloth. Most historians agree that ancient Mesopotamians paid careful attention to the heavens for practical reasons like seasonal timing and agricultural planning. Archaeology suggests that systematic observation of celestial cycles becomes increasingly important over time, and the evidence we do have points to calendars omen traditions and sophisticated skywatching that is both scientific in its method and sacred in its meaning. One interpretation is that when a culture is surrounded by uncertainty on the ground, it seeks steadiness in the sky, and you let a cinematic what-if drift in. What-if descent from above is sometimes just the language of awe aimed at patterns too large to hold in your hands. You lie back in your imagination on a patch of cool earth and you let the night air touch your face. The river is still nearby, but now it sounds smaller because your attention is up. The sky is not silent, it hums with implication. What's broadly accepted is that ancient peoples across many regions connected stars and planets with God's stories and fate, and Mesopotamia is one of the places where that connection becomes especially well documented. The evidence we do have points to a long tradition of interpreting celestial events as meaningful often as messages about kingship and the stability of the state. A careful reading might suggest that this is less about superstition in the modern insult sense, and more about a worldview where the cosmos and society are braided together. Now you notice the dangerous modern shortcut again, and you handle it gently. When people hear about ancient skywatchers, some leap straight to the idea of alien visitors. Let me rephrase that more carefully. Careful observation of the sky does not require extraterrestrial intervention. It requires patience, generations of note-taking, and a strong reason to care. And honestly, if your livelihood depends on knowing when the river will be kind, you have a very strong reason to care. Joke when you do not need star beings to invent astronomy. You just need farmers' deadlines and the primal fear of missing planting season. Still, the sky invites imagination because it is literally above you. One interpretation is that divine descent language can reflect the experience of looking up and feeling small, and that stories of gods coming down express the sense that power arrives from a realm beyond ordinary reach. The evidence we do have points to myths where the divine interacts with humans, sets destinies, grants kingship, and shapes the order of the world. Historians still argue whether specific celestial references in myths are primarily symbolic metaphors, or whether some reflect more direct ties to particular astronomical observations and rituals. You watch a bright point of light, probably a planet move, with slow insistence. Most historians agree that planets are observed and tracked, and that their movements become meaningful within omen frameworks. Archaeology suggests that these interpretations can be recorded in structured ways, and the evidence we do have points to lists and manuals that systematize, if this, then that reasoning. A more cautious explanation could be that this is an early form of pattern logic applied to the sky, not proof of secret knowledge, just humans doing what humans do, trying to make the future feel less like a surprise attack by reality. The Anunnaki sit at the background of this sky-focused mood like a quiet chorus. What's broadly accepted is that divine groups and assemblies appear throughout Mesopotamian myth, and one interpretation is that a divine assembly mirrors the order of the cosmos itself, as if the heavens run on governance. That's a possibility, not a certainty, because texts vary and later traditions can reshape earlier ones. Still, you can feel how the image works. The sky is vast, the stars are countless, so the divine becomes a hierarchy to make that vastness feel navigable. Now the mist layer returns carefully labelled because the modern imagination loves a sky ladder. A popular rumour claims that ancient descriptions of gods descending are literal accounts of craft or visitors. This isn't widely accepted, but it keeps circulating because the language of descent is so vivid. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, we can ask what else descending might mean. A more cautious explanation could be that descent is ritual language, a way to describe divine presence entering a sacred space, or divine authority entering human affairs. The evidence we do have points mostly to mythic and ritual framing, which makes literal readings difficult to establish. You feel the coolness of the earth under your shoulders, and you let your mind drift toward the already among us question in a new way. It's possible that the descendants' angle becomes compelling when you combine it with sky stories, because the sky is a natural place to put origins. But another interpretation is more grounded among us might mean within us as habits of thought inherited from ancient cosmologies. You still glance upward when you want meaning. You still tell stories that place power above. You still feel a strange comfort when the sky repeats itself with predictable cycles. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if the real descendant is the human impulse to map order onto the unknown? Joke too, if the Anunnaki are among us in that sense, they are definitely in your weather app because you check it like it has divine authority and then get mad when it is wrong. You smile, and the smile loosens your shoulders. You notice a faint line on the horizon, the glow of a city, and you think about how light pollution ruins star visibility, which feels like a metaphor you did not ask for at bedtime, but received anyway. Archaeology suggests that ancient observers in dark skies could see far more than most modern city dwellers, and the evidence we do have points to long-term observational traditions that require clear night after clear night. One interpretation is that such observation produces cultural confidence. If you can read the sky, you feel less lost. A more cautious explanation could be that even with observation, the world remains uncertain. So omen traditions become a comfort ritual as much as a predictive system. Now, because you are lying there with your thoughts, you let a gentle imagination sequence slide in without taking over. Imagine a scribe on a rooftop not far from you, counting the days between crescents, noting where a planet rises, listening to distant water. Imagine the stylus sound returning, but now it is paired with starlight. Then very softly you allow the cinematic what if. A story about beings from above began as a poetic way to honour the sky, and later listeners turned the poetry into literal biography, because literal feels easier than symbolic. That possibility stays labelled as possibility. To be clear, this is debated. The evidence we do have points to human observation, human storytelling, and human institutions shaping meaning. But the mist stays pleasant because mystery can be soothing when it is not demanding belief. Joke 3, and if you ever feel too small under the stars, remember that ancient people also felt small, and their solution was to invent gods and then give those gods paperwork, which is the most calming kind of chaos control. You sit up in your imagination, brushing off the cool earth, and you continue walking with the sky still overhead like a patient ceiling. The stars remain unbothered. The rivers keep flowing, and you keep following clues, not to prove anything, but to let your mind wander safely between what's broadly accepted and what might be interpreted with gentle imagination, never pretending to be fact. You rise and keep moving, and the night air feels a little drier now, as if the wind has carried you along an invisible trade route. The sky stays overhead, but the ground becomes the story again, paths worn by sandals carts and stubborn donkeys who absolutely refuse to be hurried by your human agenda. Archaeology suggests that Mesopotamian city-states are not isolated islands, but parts of wider networks of exchange, and most historians agree that trade connects regions through goods, ideas and styles. The evidence we do have points to materials that had to travel like stone, timber, metals, and luxury items that do not naturally appear on the flat alluvial plains. One interpretation is that when stories travel, the way goods travel, they do not remain pure. They adapt to the needs and imaginations of whoever is telling them next. And you let a cinematic what if slip in like a lantern in fog. What if the Anunnaki become more mysterious precisely because they cross borders in language changing shape each time they pass through a new mouth? You follow the scent of resin and wood smoke to a small market area, quieter at night, but still alive with the soft movements of people who work late. You hear the clink of pottery, the murmur of bargaining, and the occasional sigh of someone counting something for the third time because they do not trust their own math. Joke 1, you can invent writing, but you still cannot stop humans from recounting the same pile of goods like it might magically become larger. What's broadly accepted is that ideas can move along with trade, including religious motifs, myths, and artistic symbols. Archaeology suggests that shared imagery appears across different sites, sometimes in similar styles, and sometimes in transformed versions, and the evidence we do have points to cultural contact that can be traced in artifacts. A careful reading might suggest that a mythic name can function like a travelling label. It carries authority, so storytellers borrow it, but they may attach it to new roles or merge it with local traditions. Historians still argue whether similarities between myths across regions reflect direct borrowing from a single source, parallel development due to shared human concerns, or a complex blend of contact and independent creativity. You feel that debates settle into your body as a kind of calm caution. There is rarely one clean pipeline from origin to outcome. There are many paths, many retellings, and many reasons to adjust a story. One interpretation is that the Anunnaki as a term and idea become part of a larger mythic vocabulary that scribes and priests can use in different contexts. A more cautious explanation could be that the term's meaning depends heavily on the specific text, the period, and the local religious landscape, so modern readers should resist forcing one unified storyline. Now your mind slides toward the modern interest again, because this is where modern narratives often get their fuel. When something is complex and variable, it becomes easier to imagine there is a hidden core behind it. A fringe idea proposes that the variability itself is evidence of deliberate obscuring, as if different traditions are covering up a single truth about non-human beings. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it appeals to the part of the brain that hates messy answers. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion we can test, it gently messy. Traditions can arise naturally from human storytelling, especially across centuries and languages, without requiring a deliberate cover-up. You walk past a caravan resting area where bundles are stacked like sleeping animals, and you picture the objects inside wall-grain bitumen shells, perhaps metalwork, perhaps stone. The evidence we do have points to long-distance exchange, and most historians agree this exchange shapes economies and tastes. One interpretation is that trade also spreads prestige, and prestige spreads myths because stories can be status symbols too. You can imagine a travelling storyteller offering not just entertainment, but cultural currency, a way for a host to feel connected to a larger world. Joke 2, ancient globalization is real, and it starts with someone saying, "Let me tell you what they believe over there," and everyone leaning in like it is the hottest gossip in the region. Here you let the cinematic what if do its gentle work. What if the Anunnaki become a kind of portable mystery, a name that implies cosmic scale, and so it gets reused whenever a culture wants to talk about authority beyond the local? What if that reuse creates the illusion of a single coordinated narrative when it is really many different communities making meaning with shared materials? The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm, because we cannot hear every version of the story told in every courtyard and on every trade stop with every gesture and tone that never made it into clay. You shift from markets and caravans to language itself, because language is the most powerful travelling object. Archaeology suggests that writing and administration can spread and influence neighbouring regions, and the evidence we do have points to bilingual contexts and borrowed terms in different periods. A careful reading might suggest that when a divine term travels, it can pick up new associations, especially if it lands in a tradition with different divine hierarchies. This is suggestive, not conclusive, but it helps explain why modern readers may struggle to pin down a single stable definition for something like Anunnaki. Now, because you are following the outline contract, you let the section's promise unfold clearly. Myths travel and mutate, and the Anunnaki theme may evolve in that movement. You see how this matters, for the descendants among us question, if a term has multiple meanings across contexts, then modern claims that depend on a single fixed meaning become harder to support. Let me rephrase that more carefully. If you build a huge modern conclusion on a word that shifts over time, your foundation might be softer than you think. A popular rumour claims that all similar ancient myths across regions are fragments of one real event, like a single ancient contact story. This isn't widely accepted, but it sounds neat, and neatness is seductive. A more cautious explanation could be that human societies share recurring themes. origins, floods, sky power, kingship, rebellion, order, chaos. When cultures meet, they borrow and blend these themes even more. So similarities can arise without requiring a single hidden source. Joke 3. If you have ever watched two friends tell the same story differently after one night out, you already understand how myths mutate across centuries, and nobody even needed a trade caravan for that. You keep walking and you notice small things that could become motifs in a story. A carved symbol on a bead, a seal impression left on clay, a phrase repeated in a hymn. One interpretation is that repeated motifs become the hooks that allow a travelling story to attach itself to new listeners. And this is where your gentle imagination can float another what if safely. What if those motifs are not clues to secret bloodlines, but the stitches that hold cultural memory together, making it feel like something ancient is still among us whenever we repeat a pattern without knowing why? You breathe in the night air again, and it smells like dust and distant fire, like movement and rest mixed together. The solid ground remains, trade networks exist, cultural contact happens, and stories evolve. The mist remains. Some modern theories treat that evolution as concealment. We keep the solid ground separate from the mist. We are not proving anything tonight. We are following clues, and the clue here is simple and deeply human. Every story that survives is a story that changed. You keep walking until the trade road feeling fades and the city returns, but this time you notice faces more than walls. The night is still calm, still PG-13, still mostly about your feet and your breathing, yet you can feel the social ladder in the air like heat rising from stone. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian societies develop clear hierarchies over time, with kings, priests, administrators, artisans and labourers occupying different roles. Archaeology suggests that status can be visible in housing, grave goods, and access to resources, and the evidence we do have points to institutions that manage surplus and power. One interpretation is that when myths talk about divine descent and divine favour, they can echo the language of legitimacy used by elites, and you let a cinematic what if settle softly into the background. What if descendants is less a biological fact and more a social spell that makes authority feel natural? You pass a doorway where a family's evening meal is winding down. A child yawns, someone laughs quietly, and a bowl clinks against pottery. It grounds you. The evidence we do have points to households as the core of daily life, even in complex cities. Yet above the household, a whole architecture of rank holds everything in place. What's broadly accepted is that rulers often use religious language to justify their position, and a careful reading might suggest that calling oneself chosen by a god is not just piety, but politics. Joke 1. It is the ancient version of putting visionary in your bio and hoping nobody asks follow-up questions. Now you feel the tug of genealogy, because this section's promise is about lineage and status games. Royal lines matter. Inheritance matters. Family alliances matter. Archaeology suggests that political continuity often depends on kinship ties, and most historians agree that dynastic thinking is a powerful tool for stability, or at least for the appearance of stability. One interpretation is that divine lineage language can function like a seal stamp on a family tree, making it look official, inevitable, and cosmic. A more cautious explanation could be that these claims are rhetorical strategies that people negotiate contest and sometimes reject, which makes them social, not purely mystical. Historians still argue whether early kingship is best understood as a religious office that later becomes more secular, or as a political office that always wears religious clothing, because sacred legitimacy is the strongest kind of glue. You let that debate hang in the night air because it keeps you from oversimplifying. There is no full consensus, and the surviving texts often speak in the voice of institutions that want you to believe in their inevitability. You step into a palace corridor, imagined but vivid, where the walls are cooler and the atmosphere is controlled. Here the language of descent is not just a bedtime story, it is a lever. The evidence we do have points to king lists, royal inscriptions, and narratives that highlight continuity. A careful reading might suggest that kingship traditions create a sense of unbroken order, even when real politics is messy. Let me rephrase that more carefully. Official stories can smooth chaos into a straight line, and that straight line is useful for anyone sitting on a throne. Now you see where the modern Anunnaki Descendants idea gains traction. If ancient elites already claim divine ancestry, modern listeners might wonder whether those claims conceal something literal. It's possible that some people interpret divine descent as biological descent, like a hidden family line passed down through history. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it is emotionally potent because it offers a thrilling explanation for why power sometimes seems to cluster and reproduce itself. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, we can ask whether the surviving evidence behaves like lineage documentation or like legitimizing myth. The more cautious explanation could be that elite continuity does not require non-human ancestry. It requires money, land, education alliances, and institutions that protect inheritance. Archaeology suggests that control of resources can become self-reinforcing, and most historians agree that social stratification often persists through family networks. In that reading, Descendants of Gods is a cultural metaphor for social advantage, not a literal genetic claim. The evidence we do have points strongly toward mythic and rhetorical usage rather than biological reporting. But you also keep room for the mist, because bedtime is allowed to be dreamy as long as it is honest. A fringe idea proposes that ancient elites preserved a literal memory of outsiders by embedding it in royal genealogy, and that these lines continued quietly blending into humanity while retaining certain markers. This theory isn't widely accepted, and the evidence is thin. But if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it becomes a thought experiment. What would count as a marker, and would it survive in a way we could verify? The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm, because we do not have a direct biological data set tied to mythic labels. You walk past a scribal desk again, and the stylus sound returns, tap tap tap, like the night's own small clock. One interpretation is that writing itself can make lineage feel more real, because once a claim is inscribed, it gains durability. A careful reading might suggest that genealogies on clay are less about factual ancestry and more about a narrative of rightful order. Joke 2, if it is written down, it must be true, is a very human mistake. And honestly, your group chat history is evidence that writing can preserve nonsense with incredible efficiency. You drift into the idea of demigods and hero figures because many cultures have them. And Mesopotamian narratives include larger-than-life characters and divine connections. Most historians agree that heroic tradition often blends the human and divine to express ideals and anxieties. Archaeology suggests that these narratives serve social functions, shaping identity and values. One interpretation is that demigod language allows a society to imagine exceptional authority without breaking the human frame completely. A more cautious explanation could be that this is storytelling, not biology, and that the divine bloodline is a poetic way to describe charisma, strength, or perceived destiny. Now you let the already among us question land softly on the modern world without turning into a conspiracy. It's possible that the among us feeling comes from recognizing how lineage and status still operate today. Families still inherit wealth. Institutions still favor insiders. Titles still create an aura. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if the Anunnaki descendant idea is a modern myth that gives a cosmic face to ordinary inequality, making it feel explainable even when the real causes are painfully human? Joke 3. If you ever catch yourself thinking, surely this must be an ancient alien bloodline, consider the alternative that the secret power is just networking, which is somehow more upsetting and also much more believable. You slow your pace again and you let your shoulders drop. The solid ground remains dynastic politics, institutional legitimacy, inheritance, and myth used as social glue. The mist remains the alluring possibility of literal hidden lineages. You keep them apart like two jars on a shelf. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. You are not proving anything tonight. You are following clues, and the clue here is how easily a society can turn lineage into destiny, whether the lineage is human symbolic or only imagined. You keep moving, and the air shifts again, carrying a faint dampness that makes your skin feel cooler. It is the kind of dampness that suggests water has been thinking about its options. The ground under your feet is flat, generous, and a little suspicious, the way floodplains always are. Most historians agree that life in Mesopotamia is shaped by rivers that can nourish and destroy, and archaeology suggests that major flood events occur in the region across long spans of time. The evidence we do have points to floods leaving layers, rearranging settlements, and forcing people to rebuild. And one interpretation is that repeated flooding becomes more than weather. It becomes memory, story, and warning. Then, in the cinematic what-if mood you let, the night breathed out a soft question. What if flood myths preserve not just water, but the feeling of losing control over your world? You walk towards the riverbank and listen. The water is not roaring tonight. It is sliding along patient, as if it has learned the art of bedtime narration. What's broadly accepted is that Mesopotamian literature includes flood stories and themes of divine decision, survival, and renewal. A careful reading might suggest that these stories operate on multiple layers. At once they can echo real disasters, express moral or cosmic order, and explain why human life feels precarious. Historians still argue whether specific flood narratives preserve memories of particular historical events, or whether they are composite myths shaped by many floods and many retellings. You let that debate sit quietly, because it is the perfect example of how history and myth braid together. The solid ground is that floods happen and they matter. The mist is which flood when and how directly a specific story maps to a specific event. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm, because memory is not a clean archive. Memory is a storyteller. You follow a path where the earth looks slightly darker, as if the ground remembers being underwater. Archaeology suggests that sediment layers can record environmental changes, and the evidence we do have points to human adaptation building on higher ground, reinforcing walls, digging canals, managing water like it is both friend and unpredictable roommate. Joke 1. The rivers are basically that friend who shows up to help and then rearranges your whole house without asking, and you are supposed to be grateful because technically it is still your house. Now the Anunnaki question returns, but it returns through flood logic rather than space logic. It's possible that in some mythic frameworks, divine groups are involved in cosmic decisions about order and chaos, and flood stories can dramatize the relationship between humans and the divine. One interpretation is that divine assemblies in myths can mirror the terrifying feeling that disaster is decided somewhere beyond human reach. A more cautious explanation could be that these are narrative tools for making sense of suffering and rebuilding, not a record of actual meetings in the sky. A fringe idea proposes that flood stories are cover narratives for something else, such as a catastrophe linked to technology conflict or even contact with outsiders. This theory isn't widely accepted and the evidence is thin, but it remains popular because floods are dramatic and leave gaps in human records that feel like missing chapters. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, we can ask what the texts emphasize. Often they emphasize moral order, divine decision, and human fragility, which fits mythic purposes. That does not rule out historical kernels, it simply keeps interpretation honest. You pause and imagine a household preparing for rising water, because even without myth, real floods force real choices. Someone moves food to higher shelves. Someone ties a boat more tightly. Someone checks on neighbours. The evidence we do have points to communities that must cooperate to manage water, and most historians agree that irrigation and flood control require collective labour. One interpretation is that this collective labour shapes the social mind. If water can wipe you out, you respect systems rules and leaders who claim to manage water. You can see how a temple or a king might gain legitimacy by presenting themselves as the bridge between human effort and cosmic stability. The cinematic "what if" arrives gently, like a slow zoom in a documentary. What if the descendants among us idea is partly born from flood memory, the sense that something ancient survived while everything else was washed away? Humans love survivor stories. You want to believe that someone or something carried knowledge through catastrophe. It's possible that mythic descendants' language gives that desire a shape, a line that continues when the world resets. A more cautious explanation could be that this is symbolic continuity, a way to say, we are still here and we still matter after the river has tried to rewrite the map. Joke 2 also, if you have ever moved apartments, you already know that one flood is enough to make you start telling stories like you are in an epic saga, and that is with modern plumbing. Imagine doing it with mud bricks and hope you keep walking and the river's sound becomes more hypnotic. You think about how flood stories spread beyond Mesopotamia into later traditions, because stories that explain disaster tend to travel well. Archaeology suggests cultural contact and literary transmission over long periods, and the evidence we do have points to shared themes across ancient Near Eastern literature. Historians still argue whether later flood stories in other traditions are direct descendants of Mesopotamian texts, or whether they reflect broader shared experiences of living with rivers and storms. You let the word descendants hang there because it belongs to the section's promise. In the mainstream sense, descendants can mean literary descendants, motifs, plots, images that move from one culture to another, changing shape but keeping a recognizable skeleton. One interpretation is that the Anunnaki descendant idea today might be a descendant of modern reinterpretations, not of ancient biology. A more cautious explanation could be that modern-most audiences remix ancient material with science fiction, and modern anxieties producing a new myth that feels old because it wears old names. Still, because bedtime allows a little mist, you explore a safe imagination moment. You picture a storyteller at a fireside after a flood, voice low, describing how the gods decided, how survival happened, how the world began again. You picture listeners holding the story like a warm bowl in their hands. Then you allow the cinematic what if that storyteller also leaves a small hint, not of aliens, but of a lesson about power, about who controls water, about who claims to speak for the heavens. To be clear, this is debated and interpretive, not proof. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. The evidence we do have points to floods as real events and flood myths as layered narratives that can carry memory, theology and social commentary all at once. Joke 3, and if you ever feel overwhelmed by the scale of ancient floods, remember that humans are incredibly consistent. After rebuilding, someone immediately starts arguing over property lines again, like the river did not just erase the entire concept of property for a week. You breathe in and the damp air softens your thoughts. The solid ground stays rivers. Shape society, floods happen, and flood myths exist as cultural responses. The mist stays exactly which events inspired which stories and how later readers reinterpret them. You keep the solid ground separate from the mist. You are not proving anything tonight, you are following clues, and the clue in the water is the oldest one humans remember: disaster through story, and story can survive, even when bricks do not. You keep walking, but the river air thins and the city returns in a quieter form, like a place that has already fallen asleep while you are still awake enough to notice details. The night smells like dust and old plaster now, and the sound that stays with you is the faint tap of stylus on clay, as if someone is still practicing letters somewhere behind a wall. Most historians agree that translating ancient texts is a delicate craft, and archaeology suggests that the clay tablet record is uneven, fragmented, and shaped by accidents of survival. The evidence we do have points to missing lines, broken corners, worn signs and tablets that survived only because a building burned and baked them hard, which is a very inconvenient way to preserve history, but here we are. One interpretation is that ambiguity is not a flaw in the story, it is part of the landscape, and you let a cinematic what if drift in. What if the gaps themselves are the doors your imagination keeps trying to open? You step into a scribal room, and the shelves are not full the way you want them to be. Some tablets are missing, some are cracked, some are only fragments, like a sentence that ends mid-thought. What's broadly accepted is that modern scholars reconstruct texts by comparing copies, recognizing sign patterns, and using context to fill in likely readings. A careful reading might suggest that this reconstruction is both disciplined and humble, because even the best experts must sometimes say, "We're not sure." Historians still argue whether certain ambiguous signs should be read one way or another in specific passages, and those decisions can change how a whole scene feels. You notice how that uncertainty becomes a magnet. A more cautious explanation could be that when a text is unclear, multiple readings remain plausible, and the honest approach is to keep options open. But the human brain hates open loops, especially at night when it wants a clean ending. Joke 1. Your brain sees a broken tablet and immediately tries to auto-complete it, like a phone keyboard, except your brain's predictive text is a little dramatic and tends to insert aliens. This is where the already among us question gets a new kind of fuel. It's possible that modern theories grow not only from what texts say, but from what texts do not say clearly. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm, because missing data invites confident storytelling. One interpretation is that the Anunnaki fascination thrives, partly because the surviving record is complex and incomplete, and a name that appears in multiple contexts becomes a canvas for modern projection. You feel yourself tempted to treat translation as a simple decoding problem. Like, there is one perfect answer waiting, if you just stare hard enough. Let me rephrase that. More carefully, translation is interpretation. Even when the signs are clear, choices about nuance, genre, and context matter. The evidence we do have points to texts written in different periods and dialects with scribal conventions that shift. A more cautious explanation could be that any modern retelling is already one step removed from the original sound of the language, and several steps removed from the original lived context. Now the fringe layer arrives carefully labelled because it loves the word mistranslation. A popular rumour claims that mainstream scholars intentionally mistranslate or conceal key passages about non-human beings. This theory isn't widely accepted, and it often lacks specific testable evidence, but it persists because it offers a simple villain and a thrilling secret. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, we can ask how scholarship actually works. Many readings are debated openly, and alternative interpretations exist without needing a conspiracy. That does not mean every scholar is right, it just means the process is messy and public enough that secrecy is a harder sell than it sounds. You let that settle and you return to the human scale. A translator is a person. A scribe was a person. Both are working within systems, with constraints, with habits, with expectations. One interpretation is that some ambiguity is intentional in certain genres, especially in poetic or mythic texts, because ambiguity allows a story to carry multiple meanings at once. A more cautious explanation could be that many ambiguities are simply the result of damaged shorthand or lost context, not deliberate mystery. Still, the cinematic what if can exist without lying. What if the ancient storyteller wanted you to feel unsure because uncertainty is part of the sacred mood? Joke too sometimes. The most authentic ancient experience is not getting a clear answer, because apparently the universe has always been a little vague on purpose. You move through a space where a scholar imagined but believable compares two copies of a text and frowns gently, not angrily. The evidence we do have points to multiple versions of certain works across time, and most historians agree that copying introduces small variations. One interpretation is that scribes can shape meaning through tiny choices, whether consciously or through habit. To be clear, this is debated because it is hard to know intention from a clay mark. Still, a careful reading might suggest that even small shifts in a divine name or a verb tense can influence how modern readers build theories. Now you bring the truth ladder back into the centre, because Section 9 is about translation gaps and modern magnets. Documented tablets are fragmentary, and translation involves reconstruction. Interpreted ambiguity invites multiple readings and can affect how terms like Anunnaki are understood. Imagined what if a missing line once contained a detail that would change everything, and we will never know. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. The Among Us feeling changes shape here. It's possible that what is among us is not a hidden bloodline, but a hidden assumption that texts are precise mirrors of events. A more cautious explanation could be that mythic texts are not trying to be chronicles in the modern sense, and administrative texts are not trying to tell cosmic secrets. Yet modern audiences sometimes blend them together, treating a mythic name like a technical label and a poetic descent like a flight log. That blend can be hypnotic, and you understand why, because it makes the world feel like a puzzle that wants to be solved. Joke 3, and if you ever find yourself thinking, I can solve this ancient mystery in one late night sitting, remember that people spent their entire careers just learning the signs, and you are currently negotiating with a pillow. You take a slow breath and listen for the stylus again. Tap, tap, tap. It reminds you that the past is a craft, not a download. The solid ground remains incomplete texts, translation choices, and scholarly debate. The mist remains modern projection rumour and the emotional desire for certainty. You keep the solid ground separate from the mist. You are not proving anything tonight. You are following clues, and the clue here is quiet but powerful. Sometimes the biggest stories grow in the blank spaces between surviving words. You keep walking and you notice something subtle about the air, like the night itself has picked up a new accent. The streets feel the same. The river still murmurs nearby, but the stories around you start dressing differently, as if someone swapped out clay-scented temple lamps for paperback ink and late-night radio. Most historians agree that modern images of ancient Mesopotamia are shaped not only by archaeology, but by popular culture, and the evidence we do have points to waves of fascination that rise with discoveries, translations, museum displays, and the simple human thrill of the ancient. One interpretation is that when a name like Anunnaki moves into modern media, it becomes less a specific term in a complex tradition and more a symbol that can carry whatever a storyteller needs. And you let a cinematic what-if mood settle in like soft neon. What if the biggest transformation happens, not in ancient times, but in our own imaginations, as we keep remixing the past to explain the present? You step into a modern-feeling room without leaving the ancient city, like you have wandered into the part of the dream where time layers overlap. There is a table with books and magazines, a glowing screen humming quietly, and the same stylus tap in your memory now competing with the faint click of a keyboard. Archaeology suggests ancient cultures left real material traces, but the stories we tell about those traces are very much alive and changing. What's broadly accepted is that the 20th and 21st centuries create new genres that blend ancient myth with science fiction, conspiracy, self-help, and cosmic horror. Though we are keeping it calm tonight, no fear-mongering, no doom. A careful reading might suggest that modern retellings often simplify complex pantheons into a few dramatic characters, because a script needs a clean cast list and your brain needs a clean bedtime story. Historians still argue whether popular culture mostly helps by keeping interest alive and funding curiosity, or mostly harms by flattening nuance and replacing scholarly uncertainty with confident plot twists. You can feel both sides. Sometimes a movie or a novel gets someone curious enough to learn real history. Sometimes it plants a false certainty so sticky it takes years to peel off. Now you watch the word Anunnaki move through modern channels. In some tellings it stays close to myth and ancient context. In others it becomes an alien label, a secret bloodline, a shadow government, a cosmic ancestry test you never asked for. One interpretation is that this shift happens because modern audiences live in a world saturated with technology, so we naturally project technology back into old stories. A more cautious explanation could be that when you lack full context, your mind fills gaps with what it already knows, and what it already knows is satellites, rockets, and sci-fi. Joke 1. Your ancestors looked at the sky and saw divine order. You look at the sky and see Wi-Fi coverage, and honestly, both are attempts to feel less alone. This is where the fringe layer can be named without being fed. A fringe idea proposes that modern portrayals of the Anunnaki as extraterrestrials are closer to a hidden reality than mainstream scholarship admits. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it spreads easily because it is cinematic, shareable, and emotionally satisfying. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, we can ask what it is built on. Often it is built on selective readings, modern interpretations layered onto ancient symbols, and a hunger for a single hidden truth. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm, and modern media sometimes turns that open question into a closed answer for the sake of a good hook. You move your attention to how these ideas travel today. In ancient times, stories travelled on trade routes and in scribal schools. Now they travel through videos, forums, documentaries, and algorithmic feeds that notice what makes your eyes widen and then offer you 5 more versions of it. A careful reading might suggest that the modern Anunnaki story is partly a story about attention. What gets repeated becomes familiar, and what becomes familiar starts to feel true. Let me rephrase that more carefully. Repetition can create confidence without creating evidence. A popular rumour claims that ancient Sumerian texts describe advanced spacecraft, genetic engineering, or secret technologies, and that mainstream narratives hide this to protect institutions. This isn't widely accepted, and the evidence is thin in the sense that it often relies on loose translations, modern assumptions, and dramatic leaps. A more cautious explanation could be that ancient myth uses metaphor and ancient art uses symbolic conventions. So what looks like a rocket to a modern eye may be a stylized object with a ritual meaning. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. Now you do a gentle reality check, bedtime friendly. Most historians agree that human ingenuity can explain early cities writing irrigation and astronomy without requiring external intervention. Archaeology suggests a gradual build-up of complexity with experiments, failures, adaptations, and cultural exchange. One interpretation is that the true marvel is collective human organisation, the ability to coordinate thousands of people through institutions, stories, and shared rituals. Joke 2. And if you have ever tried to coordinate a group dinner order, you already know humans do not need aliens to make things complicated. We do it for free. Still, the cinematic what if mood is allowed a safe corner because section 10 is about modern pop mythology. What if the alien Anunnaki version is a modern myth that plays the same role ancient myths played, explaining power origins and suffering in a big, emotionally satisfying frame? What if it functions like a new pantheon for a technological age where gods become visitors and temples become labs? That is a possibility, not a certainty. To be clear, this is debated and it varies by community and storyteller. You notice the sound motif again, the stylus tap blending with keyboard clicks, and you realise that the tool changes, but the impulse stays. Humans want to narrate the unknown. Humans want origins. Humans want patterns. The evidence we do have points to that impulse across time. One interpretation is that the Anunnaki among us question survives because it is not really about Mesopotamia alone. It is about the modern desire to feel that the world has a hidden structure you can uncover. A more cautious explanation could be that the world is structured but not secretly, and the structure is often boring in the most historically accurate way: economics, institutions, environment, and human psychology. Joke 3. The scariest ancient power is not a cosmic overlord, it is a committee. And unfortunately, committees are very much among us. You keep walking, letting the neon modern layer fade back into clay and starlight. The solid ground remains. Modern media reshapes ancient terms and spreads simplified narratives. The mist remains rumours of hidden truth and dramatic reinterpretations. We keep the solid ground separate from the mist. We are not proving anything tonight, we're following clues, and the clue here is a quiet one. The Anunnaki story keeps changing because we keep telling it, and every era tells it in its own accent. You keep moving, and the modern neon fades, completely replaced by the ordinary night of a living city. The streets are quiet enough that you hear your own breathing, and the same soft tap of imagined stylus returns like a familiar lullaby. The question also returns, but in a gentler form, not: are they hiding in plain sight? But why does this idea feel so believable to so many people? What's broadly accepted is that humans build identity stories to explain who they are and where they come from. The evidence we do have points to myths and origin narratives in every culture, and archaeology suggests that ancient societies use divine language to anchor communities in time and meaning. One interpretation is that already among us can function as a metaphor for inherited patterns, the way a story can live inside a culture long after its original setting is gone, and you let a cinematic what if drift in. What if the descendant is not a person with secret genes, but a feeling that returns whenever you look at the night sky and wonder who started all this? You walk past a doorway and see a small household scene, again candlelight, murmurs the soft sound of someone tidying up. It anchors you in the human scale, which matters when your topic has a tendency to float. Most historians agree that daily life is the bulk of history, not royal drama or cosmic tales. Archaeology suggests that most people spend their lives working, eating, raising children, and negotiating small social expectations. A careful reading might suggest that the divine language of elites can filter down into everyday identity, shaping how ordinary people see themselves in relation to power. That is a possibility, not a certainty, because identity is not uniform, and people can accept, ignore, or reinterpret official narratives. Now you let the Among Us idea touch the modern listener without turning into paranoia. It's possible that the phrase "among us" hits a nerve because it speaks to the experience of living among strangers, scrolling among strangers, commuting among strangers, and never fully knowing what anyone is carrying inside. The more cautious explanation could be that the idea is compelling because it gives a dramatic label to a common human uncertainty. Who are other people really? The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm, and other minds are always partially unconfirmable. Historians still argue whether myths about divine ancestry primarily serve top-down control by elites, or whether they also reflect bottom-up meaning-making by communities trying to explain their place in a harsh world. You let that debate settle because it keeps the story honest. Identity myths can be used as tools, and they can also be used as comfort. You notice a group of workers resting near a wall, laughing softly, and it reminds you that identity is not only about origin, it is about belonging. What's broadly accepted is that groups form around shared ritual, shared labour, shared language, shared stories. One interpretation is that calling certain forces divine and certain lineages sacred can strengthen group cohesion, making the world feel less random. A more cautious explanation could be that cohesion also comes from practical necessity, irrigation, harvest schedules, defence trade. The evidence we do have points to both, and you keep them both in view. Now the fringe layer arrives carefully labelled because section 11 needs a quirky tidbit without becoming a claim. A popular rumour claims that some modern people show Anunnaki traits, often described in vague terms like unusual charisma, strange dreams, or a sense of not belonging. This theory isn't widely accepted and is difficult to test because the traits are often subjective and culturally shaped. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, we can interpret it as a modern identity myth, a way for someone to narrate their difference as meaningful rather than accidental. The more cautious explanation could be that many people feel alienated for social, psychological, or life story reasons that have nothing to do with ancient bloodlines. Joke 1, if feeling like you do not belong makes you an ancient sky descendant, then half of high school is basically a cosmic reunion tour. You breathe in and notice how calm the night feels when you stop trying to turn every feeling into evidence. The evidence we do have points to human minds searching for patterns and meaning. One interpretation is that the Anunnaki descendant idea functions as a story that makes modern life feel less random, especially in a world where institutions can seem faceless. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if descendants among us is a poetic way of saying that ancient hierarchies never fully disappeared, they just changed outfits? You walk past an administrative building and you picture the modern equivalents, offices, data centers, paperwork, policies. It's possible that the ancient temple economy and the modern bureaucratic state feel strangely similar in their emotional effect. Both can feel like a system that decides your fate from a distance. A more cautious explanation could be that complex societies require coordination, and coordination always produces institutions that can feel impersonal. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm, because systems are made of people and yet they can feel like forces of nature. Joke 2. The most believable Among Us theory is that bureaucracy is an immortal being that reincarnates in every civilization, and it always wants you to fill out one more form. You bring the truth ladder back gently because this section is about reframing the Among Us idea. Documented humans create identity myths and social hierarchies. Interpreted divine descent language can reflect legitimacy and belonging. Imagined what if an ancient name still hums in modern psychology, not as proof but as mood. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. Now you let a safe cinematic what if play for a moment. Imagine you are on a modern train half asleep and you see someone across from you whose face seems oddly familiar in a way you cannot place. Your brain suggests 100 stories: alien bloodline, secret lineage, past life, or simply the more cautious explanation, a face that resembles someone you once knew or a pattern your brain loves to match. The story you choose says more about your needs than about the stranger. That is not an insult. It is a human feature. A fringe idea proposes that hidden lineages blend into populations, shaping leadership and culture in subtle ways. This theory isn't widely accepted, but if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, we can hold it as a metaphor for how power networks reproduce themselves. The evidence we do have points to human mechanisms: inheritance, education, social capital, institutional access. A more cautious explanation could be that those mechanisms are enough, and they are already among us in plain daylight, no cosmic ancestry required. Joke 3. Honestly, if you want to find a secret society, start with any group chat labelled leadership team, because the mystery is what they do in there and you will never fully confirm it. You continue walking with your shoulders relaxed. The night remains gentle. The solid ground remains identity myths, human psychology and social structure. The mist remains modern rumours that translate feelings into bloodlines. You keep the solid ground separate from the mist, and you let the Among Us question stay what it is, at its most sleep-friendly, a mirror that shows you how humans turn uncertainty into story. You keep walking, and the city's quiet edges begin to glow, with tiny details like the night is offering you symbols one at a time. A door latch, a carved bead, a seal impression drying on clay. The stylus tap returns steady and soft, and you notice how repetition can feel like meaning even when it is simply habit. Archaeology suggests that Mesopotamian art and administrative tools include repeated motifs, especially on cylinder seals, amulets and ritual objects. The evidence we do have points to scenes of gods' worshippers, animals, plants, and abstract forms like rosettes, stars, and winged figures. One interpretation is that repeated images can create a sense of coded order, and you let a cinematic what if drift in like incense. What if the symbols are not just decoration, but the ancient equivalent of a password you can feel in your bones even if you cannot read it? You step closer to a small table where a seal is being rolled across wet clay. The result is crisp and miniature, like a comic strip from a world that takes itself very seriously. What's broadly accepted is that cylinder seals function as personal identifiers and security devices marking ownership and authenticating transactions. Archaeology suggests that seals also carry aesthetic and ideological meaning, communicating status and ritual affiliation. A careful reading might suggest that a seal image can be both practical and symbolic at the same time. It locks a jar, and it also tells you who has authority. Joke 1, it is the original login screen, except instead of a password, you have a tiny carved drama scene and a lot more clay under your fingernails. Now you notice how easy it is for a modern eye to treat repeated motifs as a cipher. You see wings and you think flight. You see a star and you think space. You see a figure with a horned crown and you think not human. Let me rephrase that more carefully. Symbols do not come with a universal legend. The evidence we do have points to conventions in ancient art where horns can signal divinity, not biology, and where stars can signal cosmic order, not spacecraft. A more cautious explanation could be that ancient artists use a symbolic vocabulary that modern viewers misread because our own symbolic vocabulary has changed. Historians still argue whether certain recurring motifs on seals and reliefs should be read primarily as religious scenes, political propaganda, or artistic conventions that vary by workshop and period. That debate matters because it reminds you that images are not self-explaining. They are part of a system, and systems need context. Still, the myth layer has a gentle right to exist in a bedtime story as long as it is labelled. A popular rumour claims that Mesopotamian symbols hide technical diagrams, star maps, or encoded knowledge about non-human beings. This theory isn't widely accepted, and the evidence is thin, but it persists because the images are mysterious enough to invite projection. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, we can ask, do these motifs show consistent testable structure like a code, or do they behave like symbolic art serving social and ritual functions? The evidence we do have points more strongly towards symbolic and administrative roles than toward technical encoding. You follow a street where small shrines sit in niches, and you see simple offerings, bread, beer, a bit of oil. Archaeology suggests that household religion and public cult practice can overlap, and the evidence we do have points to a world where symbols are not just art, but part of daily meaning. One interpretation is that symbols work because they repeat. Repetition makes the unseen feel stable. A more cautious explanation could be that repetition also spreads because it is fashionable, easy to copy, and recognizable the way modern logos spread across products. Joke 2, if you think modern branding is intense, imagine a world where your brand identity is literally pressed into wet clay and then hardens forever. No rebrand, no new font, just you and your carved goat scene for eternity. Now you connect symbols to the already among us question in a safe, non-paranoid way. It's possible that when people say among us, they mean that symbols survive in patterns that echo into later cultures, sometimes through direct influence, sometimes through shared human instincts. A careful reading might suggest that certain shapes and motifs recur across civilizations because they are effective stars, spirals, wings, trees. The evidence we do have points to long histories of symbol reuse and adaptation. One interpretation is that the descendants idea can be about cultural descent, not biological descent, with symbols acting as the inheritance. The cinematic what if mood arrives. What if you are surrounded by echoes without realizing it? Not secret rulers, not hidden bloodlines, just echoes how you draw a star, how you imagine heaven above, how you associate wings with power. Then you soften it immediately with the disclaimer that keeps everything safe. That is a possibility, not a certainty, and it does not require a literal ancestry claim. Now the fringe layer can appear again carefully framed. A fringe idea proposes that certain symbols indicate a literal presence of non-human beings, and that the repetition is evidence of a shared, suppressed memory. This theory isn't widely accepted, but if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, we can hold it as a psychological question. Why do humans love the idea of hidden messages? The more cautious explanation could be that hidden message thinking is a natural byproduct of pattern recognition, especially when you face incomplete records and unfamiliar art styles. Joke 3, your brain is basically a conspiracy machine by default. It sees two similar wing shapes and instantly wants to start a podcast. You step back and listen to the night again. The stylus tap continues and you realize how much of human life is about leaving marks. A seal mark says, I was here, I own this, I authorize this. A temple relief says, this is the order of the world. A myth says, this is how it feels to live under forces bigger than you. The evidence we do have points to all three kinds of marks in Mesopotamia. One interpretation is that the Anunnaki fascination today is partly a fascination with marks, names, symbols and images that seem to carry authority beyond their material form. Historians still argue whether we should interpret certain motifs as evidence of shared religious ideology across regions or as local variations that only look unified from far away. That debate keeps your feet on the ground. The solid ground is that symbols exist and are meaningful within their contexts. The mist is that symbols can feel like codes when you view them without context. We keep the solid ground separate from the mist. You carry one small motif with you as you continue like a pocket-sized anchor, a rosette perhaps, or a star pressed into clay. It becomes your soft callback object, not as proof of anything, but as a reminder that humans love to compress meaning into shapes. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. Tonight the evidence is strongest for symbols as social, religious, and administrative language, and the rest remains a calm, curious fog. You keep walking with that little rosette idea tucked into your mind, like a charm, and the night air feels clearer, as if the story is switching from symbols you can see to evidence you can measure. The streets fade, the temple silhouette becomes distant, and the modern world gently slides into view without jolting you awake. Most historians agree that human populations have always moved mixed and intermarried across regions, and archaeology suggests that migration and cultural exchange are constant features of the ancient world. The evidence we do have points to shifting settlement patterns, changing material culture, and later scientific methods that can sometimes trace ancestry through genetics and skeletal analysis. One interpretation is that legends of outsiders or divine arrivals might echo real migrations, and you let a cinematic what if drift in carefully. What if Descendants is a poetic memory of people arriving from elsewhere and being folded into the local story until their origin becomes myth? You walk into a modern feeling laboratory in your imagination, but it is still quiet, still dim, still bedtime friendly. There are no harsh lights, just a gentle hum, like a refrigerator, and a distant fan doing a duet. Archaeology suggests that bioarchaeology and ancient DNA studies can sometimes reveal population movement and relatedness, and what's broadly accepted is that these tools have changed how we talk about the past. A careful reading might suggest that genetics can answer some questions, but it cannot answer mythic questions directly. Let me rephrase that more carefully. DNA can show patterns of relatedness and movement, but it does not label anyone divine or Anunnaki. That's not how biology files its paperwork. Historians still argue whether we should prioritize genetic evidence, material culture, or written records when they appear to point in different directions, because each line of evidence has its own strengths and blind spots. You let that debate settle like a calm reminder that no single method is the entire truth, and that is exactly why our 70% solid ground matters tonight. Now you let the mainstream anchor land firmly. The evidence we do have points to human variation within and across regions shaped by time, geography, trade conquest, and intermarriage. Archaeology suggests that Mesopotamia is a crossroads, not a sealed container. One interpretation is that stories about extraordinary origins can arise in crossroads places because strangers are common and strangers invite storytelling. A more cautious explanation could be that mythic outsiders are narrative devices for explaining social change, not literal non-human arrivals. Joke 1. If you have ever moved to a new neighbourhood, you know people will invent a myth about you in about 3 days, and that is without anyone having to descend from the heavens. Now, the already among us question finds a new shape in the genetic age. It's possible that modern audiences hear the word descendants and think, okay, show me the test results. A popular rumour claims that certain bloodlines today carry non-human markers, and that these markers can be detected if you know where to look. This theory isn't widely accepted, and it often relies on misunderstandings of genetics or on claims that cannot be independently verified. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, we can ask what a non-human marker would even mean scientifically, and how it could persist without being obvious in broader datasets. The more cautious explanation could be that human genetic diversity is wide and surprising enough to inspire myths without requiring anything outside humanity. You keep your tone gentle and your feet on the floor. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm, and genetics, while powerful, has limits. Ancient DNA is often fragmented, sample sizes can be small, preservation varies, and ethical considerations shape what gets studied. The evidence we do have points to broad patterns, not cosmic labels. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. Still, because this section promises a cinematic. What if you allow one that stays safe and non-absolute? Imagine a migration wave entering a region bringing new skills, new customs, and new authority structures. Locals do what humans do, they narrate it. They say the newcomers are favoured by the gods, or descended from them, or touched by heaven. Over time, the memory of they came from far away becomes they came from above, because above is the easiest direction for all. That is interpretation, not certainty, but it is a plausible pathway from human movement to divine language. Joke, to humans will turn. My ancestors moved here for work. Into my ancestors were chosen by the sky in 2 generations, and that is honestly just marketing. You return to solid ground again. Archaeology suggests that Mesopotamia's long history includes periods of cultural change, political shifts, and new powers rising. The evidence we do have points to layers of interaction, not a single uninterrupted lineage. One interpretation is that the Anunnaki descendant question, if taken literally, would require evidence of a distinct trackable lineage separate from normal human variation. A more cautious explanation could be that what people sense as distinct lineage is often social elite families, caste-like structures, and cultural inheritance which are real and documentable in human terms. Now the fringe layer arrives in a more careful form. A fringe idea proposes that myths about divine descent preserve a literal genetic intervention, something like selective breeding or engineered traits. This theory isn't widely accepted, and the evidence is thin, often leaning on speculative readings of mythic language. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, the honest stance is that it remains imaginative. It can be a cinematic lens for thinking about how humans explain difference and power, but it's not established by mainstream archaeology or genetics. Historians still argue whether the most important drivers of ancient social transformation are environmental stress, technological innovation, migration, or political ideology, because in reality these factors often overlap. You let that debate lull you because it brings you back to complexity, and complexity is a kind of truth in history. You step out of the imagined lab and back into the night, and you feel the rosette motif again, now as a reminder of cultural inheritance, symbols passed down, stories passed down, people passed down. What's broadly accepted is that ancestry is both biological and cultural, and a careful reading might suggest that many descendant claims in ancient contexts are primarily cultural meaning. We belong to this tradition, this god, this city. The cinematic what if becomes softer. What if the real Anunnaki among us is the way origin stories still shape identity? The way people still look for a grand narrative to make their life feel placed within a larger sky? Joke 3. Your DNA test might tell you where your ancestors travelled, but it cannot tell you why you still feel emotional when you see a starry night. And that is the part humans keep trying to explain with myth. You continue walking calm and unhurried. The solid ground remains. Migration is real. Mixing is normal. Genetics can reveal patterns, but not divine categories. The mist remains modern rumours that try to turn myth into measurable bloodlines. We keep the solid ground separate from the mist. We are not proving anything tonight, we're following clues. And the clue here is grounded and human, sometimes from the heavens, is the language we use when from somewhere else feels too ordinary for the story we want to tell. You keep walking and you feel the story shift again, not back into ancient streets, but into the strange modern rooms where people gather around ideas the way ancient people gathered around fires. The night is still soft. The fan hum is still your friend. The rosette motif is still in your pocket, and it feels like a reminder to keep meaning small and manageable. Archaeology suggests that ancient symbols and names get repurposed in later eras, and the evidence we do have points to modern communities building identities around ancient themes, sometimes with care, sometimes with certainty that outruns evidence. One interpretation is that the Anunnaki story today is less a historical claim and more a modern mythology, and you let a cinematic what if drift in like fog on glass. What if the real question is not who the Anunnaki were, but what we become when we believe we already know? You step into a modern meeting space in your imagination, not sinister, not scary, just a room with folding chairs, soft lighting, and people speaking quietly but intensely like they are sharing something personal. What's broadly accepted is that humans form belief communities around shared narratives, especially narratives that offer identity, purpose, and a sense of being part of something larger. The evidence we do have points to modern spiritual movements, alternative history groups, and online subcultures that remix ancient material into new frameworks. A careful reading might suggest that this is not new in human history. People have always reinterpreted old stories to meet current needs. Historians still argue whether modern alternative history movements should be understood primarily as harmless meaning-making or as responses to distrust in institutions, education, and authority. You listen to the tone of the room. There is excitement, comfort, and sometimes a sharp edge of certainty. This is where monetization's safe language matters most, because the line between curiosity and fear can get thin if you push too hard. Let me rephrase that more carefully. We can explore why people believe without encouraging panic, and we can discuss rumours without treating them as conclusions. Now the fringe layer appears clearly labelled because this section promises modern cults, rumours and soft skepticism. A fringe idea proposes that Anunnaki descendants walk among modern populations in hidden networks, influencing leadership, culture, and technology. This theory isn't widely accepted, and it often lacks verifiable evidence, but it attracts people because it offers a dramatic explanation for a complicated world. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, we can study it as a story pattern. It converts diffuse anxiety into a named agent. The more cautious explanation could be that social problems usually have human causes, like economics, politics, and psychology, which are less cinematic but more testable. Joke 1. The problem with blaming secret ancient bloodlines is that it lets your actual problems off the hook, and your actual problems are absolutely still going to email you on Monday. You step out of the meeting room and into the glow of a screen, because modern belief communities often live inside screens. The evidence we do have points to algorithmic amplification shaping what ideas people see, and it's possible that this environment rewards certainty over nuance. One interpretation is that the Anunnaki as alien ancestors idea becomes more persuasive when it is delivered in confident, dramatic packages, especially if it uses ancient imagery and authoritative tone. A more cautious explanation could be that confidence is not evidence and repetition is not proof, even if it feels that way at 1 a.m. Historians still argue whether the internet has fundamentally changed how myths form, or whether it has simply sped up the ancient process of rumour and retelling. You can feel the continuity. Ancient stories spread through caravans and temples. Modern stories spread through shares and clips. The human impulse is the same. Find a story that fits the feeling, then pass it on. Now you apply gentle skepticism without being rude. The evidence we do have points to ancient texts being complex and modern claims often being simplified. One interpretation is that many modern rumours are built from a stack of misunderstandings, symbolic art read as literal technology myth, read as report translation, uncertainty treated as deliberate concealment, and social inequality treated as cosmic bloodline. The more cautious explanation could be that the world is messy and human, and messy human explanations can feel less satisfying than secret lineage explanations. Joke, 2 secret lineage stories are like the fast food of meaning. They taste great immediately, but you wake up at 3 a.m. with questions and mild regret. You let the cinematic what if have its moment because the outline promises it. What if instead of a literal hidden species among us, the hidden thing is the way belief spreads? What if the true descendant is a narrative pattern passed down through history? The pattern of saying we are special, we have secret origins, and outsiders do not understand. That pattern shows up everywhere, ancient and modern. It's possible that ancient divine descent claims and modern Anunnaki descendant claims share this social function. That's interpretation, not certainty, but it is a way to hold the story that stays grounded. A popular rumour claims that powerful families today secretly preserve ancient knowledge and control, and they use old names like Anunnaki as coded references. This isn't widely accepted, and the evidence is often thin or speculative. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, we can ask what it does emotionally. It makes the world feel explainable. It gives anger a target. It gives confusion a map. The more cautious explanation could be that power is often visible in institutions, laws, and wealth, and it does not require hidden ancestry to operate. You bring back the truth ladder gently, because this section can easily tilt into misleading certainty if you are not careful. Documented people form belief communities Rumours spread and ancient material gets repurposed. Interpreted, these communities may respond to anxiety and distrust, and myth may serve identity functions. Imagined, what if the Anunnaki story is a modern mirror that reveals our longing for secret order? Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. Joke 3. And if you ever feel tempted to join a group that promises hidden truth, remember that the first rule of secret truth is usually, do not ask for receipts, which is suspicious in a world invented by scribes. You step back into the night and feel calmer because the goal is sleep, not obsession. The solid ground remains. Modern rumours often reflect social needs and media dynamics. The mist remains claims of hidden lineages and coded control. We keep the solid ground separate from the mist. We are not proving anything tonight, we're following clues. And the clue here is gently sobering. Sometimes the most powerful thing among us is not a secret descendant, but the human desire to belong to a story that feels bigger than ordinary life. You keep walking and the night feels softer at the edges, like the world has begun to dim itself on purpose. The air is cooler, your thoughts are slower, and the river sound returns as a steady companion, not demanding anything from you except to keep breathing. What's broadly accepted is that history is built from fragments, clay tablets, broken walls, scattered symbols, and the careful work of interpretation. The evidence we do have points to Mesopotamia as a place of extraordinary human innovation, and archaeology suggests that cities, writing, and complex institutions grow from very human needs and clever solutions. One interpretation is that the Anunnaki descendant question survives because it sits perfectly on the border between what can be known and what must be imagined, and you let a final cinematic what if settle like a blanket. What if the Anunnaki are already among us, not as hidden rulers, but as a story pattern that keeps returning whenever humans look up and wonder who they are? You take a slow step and feel the whole journey you have made tonight without needing to summarize it like a school report. You can feel the truth ladder under your feet, solid ground, then mist, then solid ground again. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. That line has kept you safe from turning bedtime curiosity into rigid belief, and it has also kept the mystery alive without letting it become a trap. Historians still argue whether the most responsible way to talk about ancient gods is to treat them primarily as religious symbols and social structures, or to leave more room for the possibility that myths preserve memories of events we no longer understand. You let that debate rest because it is a good debate, and good debates do not need a winner at midnight. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm, and that is not a failure. It is an invitation to stay curious without becoming certain. You think again of the Anunnaki in their most historically grounded form, a name used in Mesopotamian tradition appearing in texts that reflect a complex religious world. Most historians agree that these traditions are shaped by institutions, politics, environment, and the human need to narrate existence. Archaeology suggests a long gradual rise of city life, with trade irrigation, scribal training, and social hierarchy. One interpretation is that divine descent language mirrors human legitimacy games, and you can still feel how kings and temples use sacred words the way modern institutions use official seals. Joke 1. The ancient world invents writing and immediately discovers the greatest power is not magic, but paperwork that people take seriously. Now, because this is the final section, you let the already among us idea land in the safest, most sleep-friendly place it can land, in metaphor, in inheritance, in the quiet persistence of human storytelling. It's possible that what is among us is cultural DNA, the way you still associate the sky with authority, the way you still look for secret order in symbols, the way you still want origins to feel grand rather than accidental. A more cautious explanation could be that these impulses are simply human, not inherited from any particular ancient group, and that is still beautiful. The evidence we do have points to continuity in human psychology across time, even when cultures change. You allow one last glance into the mist, labelled clearly, so it does not sneak into your sleep as a certainty. A fringe idea proposes that the Anunnaki were literal outsiders, and that their descendants blended into humanity, leaving subtle markers. This theory isn't widely accepted, and the evidence remains thin. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it becomes a story you can hold lightly. It is not something you need to fear. It is not something you need to act on. It is simply a modern what if, a cinematic lens that some people find compelling. Joke 2, and if there truly were hidden cosmic descendants among us, they would still have to deal with traffic taxes and customer service phone menus, which is honestly the least divine experience imaginable. You feel your shoulders loosen, your jaw unclenches, you keep the solid ground separate from the mist. Solid ground. Mesopotamia's history is extraordinary without needing extra ingredients. Solid ground myths evolve terms, shift, translations are complex, and modern media reshapes ancient names. Solid ground humans migrate, mix and inherit culture as much as they inherit genes. Missed modern rumours, dramatic reinterpretations, and the temptation to turn ambiguity into certainty. You are not proving anything tonight. You are following clues, and now you are letting the clues settle into a quiet pile instead of carrying them around. You picture that little rosette again, pressed into clay, a small shape that can hold a surprising amount of meaning. What if the rosette is your reminder that humans always compress the infinite into symbols? Stars into dots, rivers into lines, gods into names, names into stories, stories into identity, and identity into a feeling that can live inside you for years, even if you cannot explain it. Now the pacing slows and the language softens, and you let the last images become less sharp, like a painting gently fading at the edges. You're walking beside the river again, but the river is calmer than it has been all night, a smooth, dark ribbon that reflects a few stars and does not ask you to interpret them. The air smells like cool earth and distant reeds. Somewhere in the city, someone sets down a stylus. The tapping stops. The silence that follows is not empty, it is full of rest. You let yourself sit on the bank. You let your hands rest on your knees. You let the story be what it is. A blend of what's broadly accepted, what can be interpreted, and what can be imagined gently without claiming it is fact. You remind yourself softly that you do not need to solve anything to be safe. You do not need a hidden truth to be okay. You can be curious and still be calm. And in that calm, you can hold one final thought, not as proof, not as a conclusion, but as a bedtime-friendly possibility. What if the Anunnaki are already among us in the simplest way as a question we inherited? As a curiosity that rises when you stare at old symbols and feel a strange familiarity? As a reminder that humans have always looked at the sky and felt both small and connected at the same time, as a story pattern that keeps returning because the unknown keeps returning too. Now the river sound becomes your lullaby. The stars stay where they are. The old city grows quieter, like it is turning off its lights one by one. Your breathing slows until it matches the water. Your thoughts drift not toward answers, but toward softness. And you let the night do what it does best, hold you for a while gently, until your mind releases the last need to know.